Hi, everyone. This is Catherine Schleff. Thanks for tuning in for the first of the fall CUAHSI Cyberseminar series. We're really excited that you've decided to join and looking forward to this talk. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. You can see that you've been muted, and I think what we're going to do is hold off questions till the end, and then you can type them into chat and we'll ask them. We'll read them off, or the speaker will be able to see them. If you have any issues during the talk, just chat to the organizers and CUAHSI staff, and they will take care of you. So that should be it for starting stuff. In terms of introductions, I'm really excited to have Dr. Scott Steinschneider give us the talk today. He's currently an assistant professor in the Department of Biological and Environmental Engineering at Cornell University. And he obtained his bachelor's degree in math from Tufts University and his master's and PhD in civil engineering from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and then did a postdoc at Columbia University before starting his current professor position. What's really cool is that I had the privilege of first getting to know Scott during my master's degree as he was finishing his PhD at UMass Amherst. And I've always been impressed with his commitment to sharing his knowledge and time, despite being busy, especially now with his family, and also being very successful at what he does. In particular, he played a key role in helping me get up and running as a master's student. He shared our code, answered detailed questions, spent the time to really dig in and listen to the research obstacles I was facing. And since then, he's helped me in many ways. So I think his research is very exciting and at the cutting edge of what's going on in water management. So I'm excited to learn more about it today. And Scott, feel free to take it away.
Great, thanks, Catherine, and thanks for the very nice introduction. So what I decided to present today was looking at water management and climate extremes in the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Basin. And I spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to think of what to put on the first slide of this presentation, but I sat on this one. It's a painting by Miles Herman, which just sort of shows the beauty of this area, but also the agricultural activity in it. And a lot of that plays into some of the challenges that are faced for water management in this particular river basin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first, for those who are a little bit less familiar with water and climate out west, I'll have some introduction to that, and then I'll go into some of the studies that my lab has been conducting. So first, as probably everyone knows, the West is a pretty dry place, but importantly, there are certain places where it actually gets a little bit wetter. And so California is one of those places, or at least certain parts of California. And so if we were to zoom in here and we looked at California and its topography, you can kind of see where a lot of the key rainfall is falling that can drive the water system. And so for those who are unfamiliar with California's topography, you have the Central Valley, which is that sort of nice valley right in the middle of it. It looks very green, and it's sort of cradled by the Sierra Nevada mountains on the east, which are quite high, and a lower coastal range along the coast. And if I were to go back, you can kind of see that those are the two areas in California that have more larger average annual rainfall. And so in the California system, the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins, they basically drain through the Central Valley, and they are draining all of the water that is falling, particularly in the Sierra Nevada. So that is the river system that we're talking about. Now, you know, this area is sort of situated in what otherwise is a very dry west, but it's sort of this pocket where it has sort of relatively reasonable average annual precipitation, but that precipitation is quite variable. And so what we're looking at here is a map of the coefficient of variation in annual precipitation. Coefficient variation is just the standard deviation over the mean. And so you can imagine as the standard deviation gets higher with respect to the mean, we're talking about a much more variable annual precipitation regime. So in most of the eastern US, the variability in rainfall is actually pretty low. Where if you go out west, particularly in California, you can see it really going higher. And so just to give a sense of what this looks like, if you looked at a time series of annual precipitation, let's say in New York, with a coefficient of variation of 15%, this is the type of annual variability we're seeing there. You can get some droughts, you can get some wet years, but it's pretty muted, particularly if you look at a time series with a coefficient of variation of, let's say, 30%, like in California, you get much deeper droughts. And not only that, you get much higher wet periods, which were probably flood periods. So you can imagine management of water in that type of regime is much more difficult. And it gets even more difficult, and you can see that if you just look from space. So this is just a really pretty picture. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that recent drought California just went through from 2011, 2012 to 2015, 16. And there is a picture on the left of sort of what the landscape looks like during one of those deep droughts compared to in 2017 when it was much wetter. And you can see the landscape just it gets desiccated during this type of variable drought event. All right. The problem with this climate variability is compounded because lots of people like to live in California. And so there's just a lot of competition for water. So if you just look at population in California, it's been growing at a very steady clip. You know, it continues to grow. It's basically from the 40s on, the rate has been pretty constant. If you can think about other areas of the country, it has really tapered off. And the economy in California is huge. And actually, I knew it was big. I didn't realize it was this big until I started looking into this. But if you look at global economies around the world, it turns out California is 6th, behind the UK, but ahead of France. And that's just one state. I mean, that's just extremely impressive. And so there's a ton of economic activity. It draws people to this state. This state also happens to be unbelievably beautiful. So you have Yosemite, you have these beautiful beaches, you have these fields of gorgeous flowers. People want to live there. And those people who live there, they also want to grow a lot of agricultural goods. California is the top producer of agricultural goods, at least in terms of agricultural sales, of all the states in the country. It beats Iowa, and actually beats Iowa by a pretty good clip, about 3% in terms of ranking of the US total. So there's a ton of demand from all of these people and this agricultural production for water. And the way that the water rights work out in California, it's quite complicated, but there are sort of these priority water rights. And so what we're looking at here is over time, all of the allocation of surface water that has been distributed to all of these different sectors, federal, state, individual, corporate, and what have you. And you can kind of see that over time, just the amount of water that's being allocated or promised to different groups has been growing and growing and growing, and it's sort of approaching 400,000 million cubic meters, so quite a bit of water. And in fact, it's so much water that if you look at that allocation as it compares to just how much water is running through the rivers, it's quite an over-allocated system. So this plot on the right, it's basically showing in the size of the lines is the mean annual surface runoff of the rivers, and you can see the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Basin there. And the color is just how much of that runoff has been allocated to these surface water rights. And in some areas, particularly downstream, basically all of it has been allocated, or more than all of it, it's been over-allocated. Now this is, I should say that this particular depiction doesn't account for return flows, and so the situation isn't as bad as this, but it is quite an over-allocated system. And so it's under a high amount of stress in terms of water, and it's in a highly variable climate, which makes that harder. And in addition to water in California being sort of scarce with respect to the demand for it, when it does come, it can often be a huge hazard to people. So I'm not sure if folks are familiar with sort of the biggest flood of record in the region, but it's actually from 1862. That's sort of considered like the mother of all storms, historically, at least in the historical record for California. It put Sacramento underwater. And in fact, recently, a lot of researchers have been using that event and other sort of historical events to try and get a sense of what the worst flooding could be in California. And so they call this sort of the hypothetical arc storm that they create. And this is sort of a map of what the inundation would look like under this sort of hypothetical worst case storm. The basic gist here is that when it gets wet, because it's so variable out west in California here, it can get really, really wet, and it can cause these massive amounts of rainfall and significant flooding. So we have this sort of regime of really low lows and really high highs. That is a difficult water system in which to operate. And so the logical response is you better build some infrastructure to manage that variability. And they've done that in California sort of in spades. So California has one of the most complex water resources systems, I think, in the world. And this is just trying to give like a little cartoon depiction of what that looks like. And it's useful to think of, there's a lot of infrastructure in California owned by lots of different groups, but some of the big projects that are worthwhile to note are the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. So the Central Valley Project, that's a federal project, and it is administered by the Bureau of Reclamation. And you can almost think of it sort of as like, it's very storage heavy. It controls a lot of the major reservoirs out west. And those are sort of colored in red on the right there. The State Water Project is more invested in the movement of water, conveyance of water. And most notably, and I'm not sure if you can see this cursor, but the California Aqueduct is sort of a major conveyance structure out here. And what it's doing is it's taking a lot of water that comes through the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Basin, and at the delta, where it discharges into the San Francisco Bay, this aqueduct ships that water down to Southern California, which is even more dry, to provide water to folks down there. And those shipments actually have they're environmentally very contentious because they're taking away water from the delta, which is this very rich ecosystem that a lot of folks are interested in preserving. So there's a lot of conflict in the system, even with all this infrastructure that's already embedded in it, or maybe because of that infrastructure. Okay. And even with all the infrastructure that exists in California, that infrastructure is still very stressed due to climate extremes. And so during that most recent drought, from 2011 to 2015, despite all the storage that was out there, these reservoirs got drawn down very close to empty, scarily close to empty. And it was very large water shortages sort of across the state, with a lot of economic loss because of it. And then on the flip side, this infrastructure is still being stressed by extreme rainfall and flooding events as well. And so right after that drought happened, in 2017, extreme floods hit the state. And a lot of the system was very stressed, but in particular, that state project, Oroville, the Oroville Dam, it came very close to failing. So its primary spillway failed, and they had to use the emergency spillway, and then that emergency spillway almost failed, and they had to evacuate, I think it was like 150,000 people from downstream of this dam because they were worried of a catastrophic failure. So basically, California has issues, I guess is the way you sum this up. And so some of the work that we've been focusing on, some of the questions that motivate work coming out of my lab are looking at those climate extremes. Really, what are the causes of those extremes, both on the flooding and the drought side? And can we understand how wildly those extremes can fluctuate? Because we've only seen so many of these extremes in our instrumental record. Extremes are rare by nature. And so just understanding how these extremes vary is important so that we understand really what their impact could be on the water system. An obvious, or not obvious, but a natural next question is what is going to happen to these extremes going into the future due to climate change? And then, given these changes and given the variability of the system, what does that do to the water system in California? And what can we do about it? How can the system cope? And so I can't cover all of these topics, sort of the rest of the presentation, but I'm going to try and delve into each one in a little bit. And what I want to start with is zooming in a little bit more on that, on the issue of just climate variability in California. Not even climate change yet, just the natural variability. Why does it occur? Where does that variability really come from? Do we understand it? And there's two different things to focus on, both the droughts and the floods. So on the droughts, what's important to understand for what causes California droughts, the main mechanism for that to happen is something called a ridge or high pressure system off of the West Coast. So in California, almost all of the precipitation comes in the winter. It's a Mediterranean climate regime with all of its or most of its precipitation coming in during the cold season. During the cold season, moisture over North America primarily gets delivered through extratropical cyclones. Those cyclones usually form in the Pacific or in certain places over the continent, and they travel from west to east. And the way that they travel is that they track something called the jet stream, which is this river of air way up high in the atmosphere, sort of towards the top of the troposphere. During California droughts, what's basically happening is you have a high pressure ridge sitting off of the coast of North America. And that sort of redirects the jet stream further to the north, sort of towards Canada. And then all of the extratropical cyclones in the Pacific that form, instead of getting directed towards California, they're getting steered to the north. And so they're delivering moisture more towards the Pacific Northwest or up into Canada. And California remains dry. And the long droughts in California, the multi-year droughts, are when this ridging pattern sticks. And so they've, it's always good to give things a name. And so they call this thing the ridiculously resilient ridge. And that was the cause of the major long droughts in California. Flipping over to the flood side and the extreme rainfall side, the primary mechanism out in California that causes that particular extreme is something called an atmospheric river. And so you can kind of get a nice picture of this if you look at satellite images like this one of integrated water vapor in the atmosphere. So that's sort of what we're looking at on a particular day, in this case, November 7th, 2006. And what you can see is this, looks like this narrow plume of moisture shooting out from the tropics around Hawaii and aiming directly at the west coast of the United States. And it's going to deliver quite a bit of moisture to the western US coastline. And you can get a kind of for California, a really nice image of what this looks like with this particular schematic, which is not mine. The citations on the bottom left there, but it's so great, I wanted to throw it up here. So what we're looking at here is sort of a cartoon, or maybe more than the cartoon, of an atmospheric river hitting the western coast of California. And what it's showing is sort of the moisture in that atmospheric river getting lifted over the coastal range and then those Sierra Nevada range. And as you lift that moist, warm air that's coming in from the tropics, that moisture in the air, it's going to condense, it's going to precipitate out, and it's going to do that intensely. So that's where most of the extreme precipitation is occurring from, these sorts of atmospheric rivers that are coming in. And as you can imagine, many of the flood event, there'd be a lot of flooding that comes from that sort of event. And in fact, that's the case. And most of the floods out in California, they are linked to atmospheric river events. And so this is showing just one example of that. For a particular event in February, you can sort of see an atmospheric river hitting the western coast of California, and then many of the stream flow gauges either hitting record flood stage or pretty close to record flood stage for this particular event. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that the drought story and the atmospheric river story are not necessarily independent from each other. And I'm going to try and start building this as we go. And one way to build that is just to look at how much rainfall is actually delivered along the western US due to atmospheric rivers. And that's what's being shown here. And you can sort of ignore the picture in the foreground and just focus in the picture in the background. And that picture in the background, what it's showing is the percentage of total precipitation over a water year on average that's contributed by these intense atmospheric river events. And particularly in California, in the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Basin, you see around something like 30 to 40%, maybe even a little higher in some places, of total precipitation is falling from these intense events. What that suggests is that some of the variability on just total rainfall, things that we think of when we think of drought, is linked to variability in extreme rainfall. And so these two extremes, they're sort of tied together. And let me keep on going to sort of build that story, but I want to keep that in mind for some of the later stuff. Well, let me build that a little bit more here. So what I'm trying to get at is the variability in some of these intense atmospheric rivers, and what I mean by variability, the interannual variability, sort of large swings in atmospheric river landfalls over decadal periods. It actually is somewhat responsible for a lot of that scale variability that we see in total rainfall over California. It's responsible for a lot of that interannual variability of rainfall that we saw at that very beginning slide with the coefficient of variation. And that's what this sort of image is showing. So if you just focus on the top panel here, if you look at the black line, this is sort of a moving average type thing of water year precipitation over the Sacramento-San Joaquin catchment, basically. And you can see a significant amount of interannual variability. So sort of swings down for several years in a row where it's relatively low compared to the average. And then it swings up high and low, and it tends to stick in a high or low regime for several years in a row. What this picture is showing is that a lot of that variability is actually linked to variability in rainfall greater than the 95th percentile, so heavy rainfall. So that's this red line. So the variability in the red line, the very high rainfall, tracks the variability in the total rainfall very well. Where if we actually look at variability in low rainfall events below the 95th percentile, it's pretty flat. Again, this is building the idea that sort of swings of low rainfall years, drought years, are linked to low years of extreme rainfall as well. And if you go down to the bottom plot, you see that same type of variability if we look at a different variable, this time the number of atmospheric rivers that made landfall in California. So all of this is sort of building towards that interannual variability that is so difficult to manage in California is possibly directly linked to variability in this atmospheric river process hitting California. Okay, so that's all great and good. And then in terms of sort of, okay, where do you go from here? Well, if you look at some of the data that I just showed, the records of data that I showed, they weren't that long. So if we just stick on this one, maybe for precipitation, we can go back 100 years to look at variability. For atmospheric river landfalls, we're usually limited to some of the reanalysis data sets, which only go back to around 1950. And if you look at the variability in these things, we only see a couple of cycles, a handful of cycles in these data, even over those long time periods. So the point here is that we don't have that much data to really understand the interannual variability of these processes. And so because of that, it might be useful if we can reconstruct some of these climate phenomena over California to get a better sense of the type of variability that we should expect in these processes so that we can understand what that variability really would mean for the water system. So one of the main ways that people reconstruct these extremes, that trying to reconstruct them back into history before our instrumental record, so back into the 19th, 18th, 17th, 16th century, we use these paleoclimate proxies. So these naturally occurring features in the environment that record somehow the amount of moisture that fell, or that was available. And trees are really good for that. So what you can do is you can basically, as the picture kind of shows, for certain types of trees that are particularly moisture sensitive, you can kind of pull a core out of those trees, and you can sort of look at the widths of the rings of the trees, is effectively what we're doing here. And the idea is that during historical years that were particularly wet, the tree was able to grow more, and so its ring width would be wider. And during very dry years, there wouldn't be moisture to fuel tree growth, and so the tree wouldn't have grown, and so you have a very small ring for that year. And what's really nice is that these tree ring chronologies, they are annually resolved. You get a ring for every single year. And out west, there are some trees where you can get these chronologies that go back about 1,000 years, very old trees. And so what that allows you to do is sort of use these ring widths to try and reconstruct how wet you think it was in certain places, going back all the way to around about 1,000 years in the past. So folks have been doing this for quite some time, and they found that it's very, very useful to do this to try and reconstruct droughts. And a common approach to do that is to take these tree ring chronologies and to try and relate them to annual stream flow in certain large rivers. And so that's sort of what we're showing here. So for a set of sort of reconstructions that were available in the San Joaquin Basin, what we're showing is the observed flow in million acre feet in sort of a 4-river index for the San Joaquin River versus a reconstructed flow based on these tree ring chronologies. And the relationship is pretty good, suggesting that you can then take those tree ring chronologies that go back quite far, and you can reconstruct the San Joaquin River flow going back all the way, let's say the year 900 or so. And if you do that, then you can start understanding, have we seen worse extremes than we have seen in our instrumental record? And in fact, the story out west is kind of scary. I mean, if you were to zoom in on, let's say, the 15th and the 16th century, you see this period where, occasionally it kind of goes above average, but for 100 to 200 years, it was sitting well below average. So this is a very scary mega drought, you might call it. And you can ask the question, what would this type of drought do to the existing system with the existing demands and the existing infrastructure? So you can try and test those things. But as I was trying to get at before, the droughts are not entirely independent of the atmospheric rivers that bring the floods. They tend to be pretty tied together. And so this sort of sparks the question, could you potentially use some set of tree ring chronologies across the Western United States to reconstruct extreme rainfall events that might cause flooding out in California? And on the face of it, that idea, frankly, is kind of stupid. And it's stupid because trees are responding to the total moisture that's available to them over the whole growing season. And in fact, extreme rainfall and floods might even kill trees. So there's not a good reason to think that you could use tree ring chronologies to reconstruct extreme events, particularly the high extremes. But out west, and particularly in California, the situation's a little different. So out west, like we said before, a lot of the total rainfall that is falling is being delivered in the form of extremes. And in addition, it's being delivered in the cold season. Trees really aren't growing that much in the cold season. But a lot of that moisture gets stored as snow and then gets released during the summer growing season, and the trees can eat that right up and grow. And so what we found is that if we correlate some measures of extreme precipitation, like the number of events greater than the 99.5th percentile on a grid cell by grid cell basis for some gridded precipitation product, against these tree ring based moisture proxies, if you look out in California, you get these very high correlation values, suggesting that the tree ring chronologies actually do capture a lot of information about at least the number of extreme events that are coming in and hitting California. This sort of raises the promise that we could reconstruct these events using those chronologies. But we actually might be able to do a little better. We might be able to make our reconstructions of extreme rainfall and atmospheric rivers a little better by looking at some particular recent science on the topic of atmospheric rivers and how they hit the West Coast. And so this was a really nice review paper, or paper with a nice review sort of schematic at the end by Jonathan Rutz that came out, I think it was 2015. And what it's basically showing is how atmospheric rivers, when they hit the West Coast, how they puncture into the continental interior. So when they hit the West Coast, they don't just hit the West Coast, rain, and then go away. They keep on moving into the continental interior, and they do so in these somewhat predictable patterns. And so what this is basically showing, these red areas here, these are areas where the mountain ranges are really, really, really high. And so when atmospheric rivers hit that area of these mountain ranges, they completely rain out, all the moisture gets sucked out because there was so much orographic lift, and the atmospheric river doesn't puncture very far into the interior. But occasionally these atmospheric rivers get funneled through these low elevation conduits in the coastal mountain ranges, and they can deliver moisture further inland. Now, the reason that this is so nice is what this suggests is we might be able to use spatial patterns in the tree rings to reconstruct the occurrence of atmospheric rivers that follow these predictable spatial patterns of their pathways through the western US. And so we actually tried this down in the Southwest. And so as part of this study, what we did is we took a gridded tree ring based drought index. So it was basically a reconstruction of the Palmer drought severity index using tree rings. And for an area in the Southwest, which is this red box, we just did a rotated principal component analysis of that data. And we're kind of plotting the spatial patterns of what that looks like in the tree ring based drought index on the top. And what you see are these two characteristic patterns in the drought index, of the tree ring based drought index. One is this sort of south-north pattern centered on sort of northern Mexico and southern Arizona and New Mexico. And one is more an angled pattern that sort of comes in southern California and then traverses sort of southern Nevada and into Utah and maybe Colorado. And what we did is we took these rotated principal components of this tree ring based moisture proxy, and we just correlated them or composited atmospheric flow and atmospheric pressure to these data. And that's what's being shown on the bottom. And so if we just take this bottom left example, what we're basically showing is that when we see this pattern in the tree ring sort of proxy data set, in the instrumental period, what that is associated with is basically a cutoff low over the southwestern US and a strong flux of moisture, which is the arrows, from sort of the eastern Pacific, from in a north-south-north direction into Mexico and Arizona and New Mexico, which is what's dropping the moisture and causing this signal right here. And if we do that same thing for the second pattern in the tree ring proxy data set, we get a trough sort of sitting over the western California that delivers strong fluxes of moisture, particularly into southern and central California. And this would be particularly relevant to the Sacramento-San Joaquin. What's really nice about these results right here is that they match up really well with someone's separate analysis on patterns of atmospheric river flow in the atmosphere. And so I won't go into too much details, but basically in this paper, they looked for major patterns in integrated moisture flux during atmospheric river events. And what they found are two characteristic patterns. This one, which looks a whole lot like this one, and the one over here, which looks a lot like our cutoff low example, but just shifted a little bit west. So the point here is that if you study atmospheric rivers and the variability of those events and sort of patterns in those events, they align really, really well with spatial patterns in tree ring based proxies. again, suggesting that you can use those tree ring-based proxies to maybe reconstruct these past atmospheric river events and the extreme rainfall that occurred with them. So that's what we tried to do. So we went to a data set that's available for the Western US, and we took a bunch of landfalling atmospheric rivers down in Southern California, down here. So for every year, we have the number of atmospheric rivers that made landfall, and we see if we could reconstruct them with tree ring chronologies. And that's basically what we're showing here. And so what we're showing here is that this index of the number of atmospheric rivers hitting Southern California is highly correlated with chronologies, tree ring chronologies, which are all these things, across the entire Western US. And that if you use these data to make a model of the number of atmospheric river landfalls, you get a pretty good model. And in fact, this was a highly penalized model, so we did our best to avoid overfitting in a cross-validated way, and we still got very, very good predictions, which suggests we can sort of reconstruct, which is on the bottom there, the number of atmospheric rivers that are hitting the Southern Central California coastline. And we get some interesting patterns and ones that actually we'd probably expect. So I'll just point out a few features in this reconstruction. Number one, it's hard to see the exact time scale here. Remember I had mentioned that 1862 event, that's this thing. And our reconstruction, which wasn't trained on that data, suggests the most number of atmospheric rivers in the whole record for 1862, which is good. And also there are peaks in our reconstruction that align with written records of extreme rainfall and flood events across the Southwest. What's also sort of a good sort of just sanity check, if you go back to sort of the 1400s, 1500s periods, which I previously showed was dry in this region, you also see a pretty significant decline in the mean number of atmospheric rivers making landfall. So that's also consistent, and again, sort of reinforcing the idea that atmospheric rivers and droughts are kind of very related in this particular region. Okay, so this was all up to this point on climate variability. We also want to at least think about climate change as well. So there's some types of climate change that we think we kind of understood pretty well. It's going to get warmer. That should lead to sea level rise. The warming air is going to change runoff patterns. But there are other things that are going to change that are much less certain, particularly precipitation. And for the Sacramento-San Joaquin, stream flow. So this is sort of a plot showing projections of annual inflow. I think this is for Folsom Reservoir, and sort of the range that you get over a large ensemble of GCM projections over different scenarios. The range is quite wide, so the uncertainty is really high. There's some other interesting things just to point out for climate change. I mean, you could try and dig into this a little deeper and say, okay, instead of just looking at total rainfall or flow, what's going to happen to those atmospheric rivers? Well, there's some thought that they might move equatorward, but it is kind of a noisy signal. So that's what this is sort of showing, an equatorward movement of atmospheric river landfalls. But the signal is not terribly strong, and so again, there's a decent amount of uncertainty there. Something that we're actually a little bit more certain on, though, is just the general effect of extreme precipitation under warming. So there's this theory, the Clausius-Clapeyron scaling theory. The basic idea is the warmer it gets, the more water the air can hold. And so if that's the case, when it's raining heavily, it should rain more because it could just rain out more of that extra water vapor. And models actually in the 80s were predicting that this was going to occur. So they were predicting that what you would see is more heavy extreme precipitation events under warming and maybe fewer light precipitation events because you stabilize the atmosphere after those more extreme extremes occur. And just recently, we're starting to see this in the observations, particularly of extremes. And so this is sort of showing for really extreme rainfall events, the change in frequency that we would expect under this Clausius-Clapeyron scaling, which is this dotted blue line, is matching what we're seeing in a lot of the observations. So that's sort of good. So maybe the extreme rainfall changes are a little bit more certain than some of the aggregate annual totals. So we have a very variable climate in California that's potentially changing in some ways that we know, in some ways that are actually very uncertain. What do we do? So really, what are our adaptations to these types of variability and change? Well, one thing we can do is we can try and build more storage or conveyance infrastructure, but that is a very hard sell nowadays, particularly the environmental pushback you would get on that. It almost makes it not an option. There are other things you can do like urban conservation and reuse, and folks are pursuing that. You can try and fallow agricultural fields and pay farmers to do that. You can try and get new sources of water like desal plants or import, but that can be very expensive. Some other things you can do that wouldn't be so expensive would be to modify operating policies at reservoirs for changing hydrology, and maybe coordinate that with better management of groundwater resources. And so in the next study that I'm going to show, we're going to try and pursue some of these because we prefer sort of these low-cost, flexible options for adaptation due to the large degree of future uncertainty. And so one opportunity that we pursued here was the opportunity to use short-term forecasts for reservoir management. And that idea has been around for quite some time. But once you start understanding the climate out in California, you realize that it's a really good idea out in California. And the reason is because most of the flood events that are occurring are these atmospheric river events, and we can see these things forming out in the Pacific several days in advance. And we can forecast them with a high degree of accuracy in the short term. So what that suggests is we can manage our reservoirs and their levels based on those forecasts very effectively. And this is very good because out west, the way that reservoirs are managed out there, a lot of the big ones, some fraction of the reservoir is always kept full for water supply, but the other fraction of the reservoir is always left empty so that it could catch floods in case those floods occur. Now, this made a lot of sense when these rules were developed in the 50s and 60s and forecasts weren't that good. But if you had a really good forecast of when flood rainfall was coming in, well, it would be much better if you could keep your reservoir full more of the time and then just draw it down right before the storm came in. That way, if a drought happens and none of these storms come in, you start your reservoirs much more full going into that drought. So that's the basic idea we're trying to test. Can we use forecasts of atmospheric rivers and the extreme rainfall events that they bring to keep reservoir storage close to full, or at least more full than usual? And then in addition, if you do that, maybe you'd have better luck making slow releases from that extra storage and get that water into the ground, bank it there for use during a later drought. So these were sort of the questions that we were looking to explore in this study. And, can we use 3-day weather forecasts? Are they accurate enough to improve flood control operations? Can that improve water supply? Can that improve groundwater banking strategies? And also, can we create these operating rules that work well at a sample, under cross-validation, make sure we're not overfitting stuff? So the basic gist that we did, we focused on in the American River on the Folsom Lake, and we pulled this data set of what's called hindcasts or reforecasts from numerical weather prediction models for the period 1999 to 2010. So this is where these climate institutions, they took their models, they initialized them at a particular date, and they ran them out for, let's say, 30 days, and that was a forecast for that historic date. They saved those forecasts, and then they did it again, and they did it again, and they put this big database of these hindcasts up online. Well, we took these hindcasts, and we said, okay, we have about 10 years of hindcast data. That's not that long. So what we actually developed was this synthetic forecast approach, where we looked at the error structure of the numerical weather prediction models and sort of created these synthetic forecasts that respected that error structure. And this allowed us to create these synthetic forecasts that went all the way back to 1915. And then what we did is we build policies, these release policies for Folsom Lake based on this forecast information to see if we can improve flood control and water supply in the area. Okay, so here's just some of the details of that. We looked at some of the forecast errors from those numerical weather prediction models, and what we found was they usually overpredict the low precip event and they underpredict the high events. We put that through a hydrologic model, and we saw those same biases in the hydrologic model output. But the idea is that these policies we're going to train can account for that bias. And so that's what we did. We fit sort of this new type of optimization that my colleague John Herman developed, called policy tree optimization, to develop release strategies conditional on this forecast information. And so basically what this thing does is it uses indicator variables, so like forecast information, to create basically these branch off decision rules of the type of releases that you should make. And so it's a very simple interpretable approach, and it allows for sort of just to create this if-then statements of rules. And so we optimize this with a genetic algorithm, and it sort of looks something like this, where the genetic algorithm is looking for different trees of policy that make really nice releases. Okay, so what we did is we took that optimization setup and we set up a specific type of problem. One in which we used as an indicator variable forecasts of storage based on these forecasts I've been talking about. And we will trigger different actions like release demand or hedge your releases or get water into the ground or make flood control releases to hedge against an upcoming flood based on these indicator variables. And we did it under a variety of scenarios. One where we had no forecast, one where we had a perfect forecast, and then based on the actual forecast data, and also for different scenarios of different groundwater recharge capacities. And what we were basically trying to do was minimize water supply deficits without having any floods happen. And this is what we got. And so what we're showing here is for different amounts of groundwater recharge capacity, basically the amount of water supply deficit, where going down on the y-axis is good. And so two things to point out. One, this rule curve approach does a lot worse than actually using forecasts, because rule curve is higher on the y-axis. And also, when you use actual forecasts, you're pretty close to what you can get with the perfect forecast, which is very good. And that's because these forecasts are pretty accurate, at least at 3-day lead times, because these events are very large-scale events. Okay. So for the sake of time, I'm going to skip through a couple things, but I'll show this one in more detail. What we're looking at here is just an example of what these types of rules do under one particular flooding event. So in particular, the 1986 flood event. And so if you look at the rule curve, what the rule curve does is it basically stays flat, and then when the storm happens, it stores the water and then it releases it. If you go to the perfect forecast, the way the operating policy works is the reservoir actually stays full until it sees the storm coming, and then ahead of time it draws down the storage and then fills up during the event. Our actual forecasts basically do exactly what the perfect forecast policy does, just with a little bit more spread because of the forecast uncertainty. But you see the same thing. We draw down a reservoir before a storm, and then we pop back up. Okay. And this is basically showing that if you include that groundwater recharge capacity, you can really recharge your groundwater storage and then use it during some major drought periods, which is what's being shown here. And then finally, what was very nice is what we found is that the policies that we train, if we use them on data that we did not train on, they still worked pretty well. And so what this plot is showing is for all of these different scenarios of the type of forecast we were using and the amount of groundwater we were using, we're looking at the objective function under calibration, which is in blue, and then under validation, which is in this yellow color. And basically, as you move to the left, that means you're doing better. And so what we find is, while we certainly lose performance under cross-validation, all of these yellow, red areas, they're below 1, which means they're still providing improvements over sort of a status quo set of operations, suggesting that these policies based on forecasts, they are improving things even under scenarios we haven't seen. So to end, I'll just say, what I've tried to paint a picture of is how variable the climate is in the area of Sacramento-San Joaquin Basin, what causes that variability, and then maybe our ability to reconstruct that variability, and then maybe our ability to operate the system in a smarter way to control that variability better. And so what I'd like to do moving forward with this type of work is to follow a similar procedure, but to create some different scenarios to test our forecast policies based on reconstructions from that paleoclimate data set I talked about, and sort of see if we can't really construct new operating rules for the system that would be low cost, that can manage a lot of the type of variability we would see in the system and improve benefits for everybody. And with that, let me end and say thanks. Thank you, Catherine, for inviting me to give the talk. And I guess I'll take any questions now.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, for that talk. Does anyone have any questions? Let's see. Well, I guess if no one has an immediate question, I do have a question. Scott, what about—
Start us off, Catherine.
Yeah, so what about the fact that the ability to forecast is highly based on the atmospheric river presence, based on my understanding of what you were presenting. So how transferable is this idea? Maybe you could transfer it up and down the California up and down the Sierra Nevada, but then you kind of run out of possibility once you get either too far south or north, or maybe inland, for example. So basically, ability to do the type of incorporation of forecasts that you're seeing, is that limited to the California situation, or do you see potential for that in other locations across the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the way I would pitch this as a very high level statement is, in regions where the flood climatology is dominated by synoptic scale events, this is probably more of a viable strategy. Basically, anywhere where when you get flooding, it's because of these really large scale storms that you tend to be able to see coming with relative accuracy. That's when there's a much higher chance you'd actually be able to make big decisions in terms of operating policy, given those forecasts, to manage the variability. It's particularly relevant in areas where your water supply is almost like part and parcel with the occurrence of those extremes. So you want to be able to capture the water from those extremes because it accounts for so much of the water that gets delivered to your region. So California provides like a wonderful example of the nexus of all those things. But there are probably other places as well. So I might think if I went down to the Chilean coast, I'm probably looking at something that looks a lot like the Californian coast, right? By the way, the Chilean coast gets the same type of atmospheric rivers. It's just in the southern hemisphere. You got that same mountain range, sort of banking a coastal area with the Pacific Ocean on its west. It's a very similar setup. And down in that climate, also quite variable. So I actually think stuff like this, including the reconstruction with tree rings, you might be able to transfer down to that, South America in that region as well. And in North America, you could probably go up a little bit into Oregon and Washington, but it gets a little harder because those areas are wetter, just on average. But you could probably go down into Mexico as well and probably make it work there, at least for certain parts of Mexico.
Thanks. We have some questions now from other people. So a question is, what is the geographic extent of the tree flow database?
Yeah, so it's pretty, actually, can you see my screen still?
Yes, we can.
So instead of me making something up, I can just do this.
Yes.
There you go. So you can sort of go into this map. And so here's the website TreeFlow. And I had clicked on California to get all of these sort of areas of reconstruction. But you can go to other places. So I can go to the Lower Colorado. I don't know what I'm going to find here. So, okay, there's 4 reconstructions there. Pacific Northwest. There's a few. So you can go all over. But I think in certain places, you might not have any data. So there's the Ohio River Basin, and there's nothing there. I bet there's other places out east where you probably don't have anything. I think a lot of this work has been conducted out west, and so that's where a lot of that data is going to be. And a lot of the best chronologies are out west.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks. Also a really cool feature of doing this online. So another
Yeah,
question. We have two more up in line. The first one is, how expensive could be the water supplies for California in the future due to uncertainties from climate change?
how expensive. I don't know if I have a good answer to that, but I would say this. There's a lot of money at stake in terms of water use out in California. And so if you started to have reductions in water deliveries that really actually clamped down on people's activities, you would lose a lot of money. I don't know the numbers to put on it, but I mean, I could say things like, if you look at the drought that just happened, oh, I forget the total cost to it, but 30 billion, some 10 to 30 billion, something in that range. It's in the tens of billions for the cost of that drought due to lost agricultural activity, as well as sort of electricity prices going up because hydropower falls substantially, and hydropower is a really cheap form of electricity. There's all these knock-on effects that can happen. And if you were to get shortages like that, you would get costs like that more often.
Yeah, it seems like the cost could be huge.
Yeah, I would say the costs could be huge. And actually, what happened during the last drought, many of the farmers, particularly those of certain types of agricultural goods where you can't let them die. So if you think of something like almond trees, right? You plant them, they cost a lot of money to put in. You cannot let those things die from an investment standpoint. And so you can't just let it go for a year or two. You got to keep watering them. And so what a lot of those farmers did is they would just pump groundwater extensively to keep their farms alive. And that led to a severe drop in the groundwater reserves in California, which basically do not really get recharged in any effective way. So as you use that, it's gone. And so there's a major concern of really drawing that groundwater reservoir down to the point of depletion. And if that were to happen, it's actually quite unclear how the state would get through another major drought.
Yeah, and so I've got one more tree ring question and then another management question. So how about I'll go to the management one since that is follow up to what we are just talking about. This question is, how do current water management policies, legal requirements, et cetera, influence the ability to adopt these alternative management procedures? And similarly, have reservoir managers been open to this kind of change in operating strategy? And so once you answer that, then we'll go back to the other tree ring question.
Great. Yeah, so those are very, very good questions. So what actually motivated that study on using forecasts for managing reservoirs, which by the way, I should say that type of study has been done a lot. We were just trying to look at it from a perspective of atmospheric rivers and the skill based on those. So people have been looking into using forecasts for reservoir management for quite some time. Recently though, particularly during this last drought, there's a funny story, I guess you'd call it funny. During the drought, I think in 2015, it had been this terrible drought that was lasting a very long time, and it was an El Nino that year. And actually, it was forecasted to end the drought, but there was an El Nino bust, so the forecast didn't work. Not a lot of rain came in, but one big storm did come in, and it filled up a couple of reservoirs above their conservation pool. And the Army, once the water rises above the conservation pool into the flood pool, the Army Corps of Engineers takes over the management. And they went ahead and they followed their operating policies, which is to release that water out to sea. And all of the water utilities in the area were just like, what the hell are you doing? Don't let that water go. There's no forecast of any additional storms, and we're, desperately suffering from this drought. But that's what the operating policies are for the Army Corps, and they were following them. And so sort of motivated from that sort of set of experiences, a couple things happened. One, the Army Corps proactively got on board saying, we understand this is a problem. And they joined a broader federal agency effort to study forecast-informed reservoir operations. So this initiative is called FERO. And so there's lots of studies going down this area in California because of that experience. And then even in Congress, I think there was an act called the Forecast Act that made it to committee, but I don't know what happened to it. But basically to require the Army Corps to look into the use of forecasts to improve operations at their facilities. So there are other organizations that control reservoirs that aren't the Army Corps of Engineers that do currently use forecasts. But at the federal level, they do, but it's more constrained of how they can do it. But there is an effort to sort of improve that.
And then, so then now going back to the tree ring. So one question was, how can annual tree rings be translated into monthly flow? And then someone else is wondering, is there a way to use is there another method besides the tree flow method that could be used to carry out this research in other parts of the world? So for example, West Africa, Nigeria that has flood events. So kind of two tree ring questions.
Yeah, so for the monthly disaggregation, that's hard. It's hard because really what you have is you have a measure of a single measure for a single year. And so to disaggregate it, there are strategies you can take. One thing to do would just to be to like look at historically when you've seen a wet year or a dry year, what has the monthly cut up of stream flow or rainfall looked like in those years, and you could sort of synthetically or statistically do a disaggregation. If you wanted to be more scientific about it, there are some more complicated data that you can read into the tree rings or other paleoproxies that might give some seasonal information. But I'm aware of them, but frankly, I don't want to go into too much detail because I'm not aware enough to speak intelligently. But I think you might be able to use additional paleoproxies to maybe be able to do something towards a monthly disaggregation. But if it was me, I would statistically do it, just because it's easier. And for the second question, if you want to go somewhere else, so it depends on what paleoproxies are available where you go. So that tree flow thing, I didn't even really use that. I just showed it as like a product that's out there. I used the raw chronologies, which are available in a global database of tree ring chronologies. So you can look and see if tree ring chronologies are available in your area of interest. If they're not though, I mean, if you're in some places of the world where just trees don't grow, you won't have tree ring chronologies to do this sort of work. But there might be other proxies that you could use. So some people use corals if they're trying to reconstruct sea surface temperatures in ocean. They can also use corals near shorelines. The corals will respond to sort of like the freshwater content or the salt content of the water. And so like more river flow dumping into the coastal zone changes the salinity, the coral responds. And so you can actually kind of use the corals to reconstruct river flow type stuff. It's all very cool. And it might be available in the area you're interested in, but it kind of depends on what proxies are available for your particular region of interest.
Great, thank you, Scott. I think that's a good wrap up, and we really appreciate your presentation.
Great, of course, it's my pleasure.
Yeah, so everyone, if you're still listening, looking forward to having you next week for another installment of the CUAHSI Fall Cyber Seminar. Otherwise, have a great evening.
Bye.
Thanks and bye.